I once taught a course to honor students. It was an elective on medical device failures. A third of the class were from the business school, a third were from the health sciences, and a third were from engineering. And at the end of the course, the feedback I got from students was, this was an interesting course, but it left me depressed every day. I never, ever want to have a medical implant put in my human body. And why are there not more females in management positions who will obviously say that some of these medical devices are crazy? Or they didn't use the word crazy, but it never struck me until I actually taught this class to the students that many of the examples have adversely affected females more than males. And so I picked a few examples from the course I taught, and I'm going to share with them with you today. Let me say I am walking a tightrope here, because I don't want to gross you out, but I do want to highlight a few cases in the medical device industry that are alarming. I also don't want to get into politics and religion. This is an ethics symposium, but sometimes these things get awfully close to each other. So with that said, I want to emphasize that this is not something of the past. The issue with ethics in medical devices is very current. This 36-minute listen you can get on NPR. It's entitled, obviously, Are Implanted Medical Devices Creating a Danger Within Us? It's available from 4 years ago, and you can still download the thing. Here was the person who did the journalism behind this research, or this work. This story here, if you can look at the date, March 30th, 2022, just a few days ago. This healthy-looking individual, Hannah Wilt, unfortunately died. And we don't know for sure the reason. Well, she died from mesothelioma. What we don't know for sure is what caused that. There is a chance that it was caused by talcum powder. And one of the largest...
Tens of thousands of cancer patients, mostly women, are suing Johnson & Johnson. They say asbestos in the company's baby powder made them sick, an allegation that Johnson & Johnson denies. But now J&J is using a controversial bankruptcy maneuver to delay and possibly block their lawsuits permanently.
So the issue here is, obviously Johnson & Johnson is a very large international company, and they were selling this baby powder product, and they're now facing something like 38,000 lawsuits. So what they're doing, and this gets into the ethics of it, is they're cleaving off that whole division into a separate company. The company will declare bankruptcy, but protect the rest of Johnson & Johnson. And some of the people who have died from cancer won't get what many people would think they might be entitled to. So there's a whole ethical discussion as to whether big companies like this should be allowed to cleave off the risky portions and put them in a separate company to protect the rest of the company. Now let me say, first of all, the issue with this powder is that it's a trace product. So you cannot be 100% sure that it is because of the powder or the asbestos in the powder that they got this mesothelioma. It could have been just a random event. So we don't know for sure. But that aside, the ethics of whether companies can cleave off parts of their company is one that could be open to discussion. Here's another very recent situation. You may have heard of Elizabeth Holmes. She's been in the news a lot. You know, if I go home and my wife says to me, "How was your day?" and I say, "Well, it wasn't so good, I got a parking ticket." Imagine going home and speaking to your significant other and saying, "Yesterday I was worth $400 million. Today, zero." Her company, Theranos, seemed to be spectacularly successful. They made a product that you could measure chemicals, if you like, or markers in the bloodstream that would tell you how effective the medication was that you're giving this patient. And if and you could change the dosage accordingly. The reality is that the entire thing was fake. And Elizabeth Holmes, I believe, is incredibly good at speaking and convincing investors that this product is incredible. It's going to change the way medicine is conducted. But the fact that she did this whole thing on fake data is incredible, and the fact that she raised so much money and had companies like Walgreens and others potentially selling this product. It was a consumer over-the-counter type thing that you could go and measure these markers in your bloodstream. It just seemed too good to be true for many people, and they invested in her company. So if you are interested in the story of Theranos, it is remarkable, and how anybody can get a company to skyrocket so fast and then crash so quickly. Obviously, you all heard of Stevie Wonder. You may wonder why he became blind. And the issue is that when he was born prematurely. And when that happens, your lungs are not developed, and you often need extra oxygen. What they did not realize at the time is if you give too much oxygen, it affects the retina and you become blind. It took a lot of investigating to find out why these infants who were born with healthy eyesight suddenly became blind after receiving oxygen therapy. But once again, at the time, they had no idea it was the oxygen. So the ethical issue here, and obviously now we have pulse oximeters that can measure the oxygen level in your fingers, and they can get some idea as to whether you have enough oxygen in your body or not. But the ethical issue here is you want to give oxygen to counteract some of the issues of being premature, but you don't want to give too much oxygen because there's a risk of blindness. As engineers or scientists, we would like to say there's a clear cutoff. If you have this much oxygen in your bloodstream, you're fine, and your eyesight is going to be protected, but it's not as clear as that. So, and this is unfortunately the truth in many medical situations where it's an ethical decision. I want to give more oxygen. I know there's a risk of blindness, but I got to protect the infant, and so well, let's do it and see what happens. Okay, so those were just so I'm going to give you some other case studies in greater detail. But if you look at this table here, on the left, a lot of this is taken from the Biomedical Ethics for Engineers. On the left, it says engineers shall, for instance, hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And then there's this Gertz rules on the right. And so some of the examples I'm going to share with you highlight either comments on the left or comments on the right. So let's start off with the first one here. Hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And the equivalent on the right-hand side is do not kill, do not cause pain, do not disable, do not deprive of pleasure, and do not deprive of freedom. So we get to the situation of women who may potentially need a hysterectomy. And in fact, there are many patients with this situation. By the age of 60, perhaps a third of all women will have had a hysterectomy. So there may be very good medical reasons for undergoing this procedure. The question is, how do you actually go about doing this procedure? So this is a morcellator. It's like excuse the expression, a frog in a blender type thing. It's got a spinning tip that whips around and it shreds tissue. In this case, it's shredding the apple. And the idea is that you insert this into the patient, you shred the uterus, at the same time you apply a suction, and it sucks out the tissue that you're trying to remove. It is very appealing for both, well, some patients can be convinced that this is very appealing because it's relatively quick and you can get back to work very quickly afterwards. It doesn't require a huge operation. I can see some people in the back cringing. I said, I'm walking a tightrope here between not grossing you out and informing you of some ethical issues. So, but from the patient's point of view, there is a potential that you can get back to work quickly. From the surgical point of view, it's beneficial because you can get patients in and out all day long, charge a certain amount, and the hospital could be making quite a bit of money in the process. So that's the initial charm. It minces up tumors, it can get through a lot of tissue quickly, and the incision in your abdomen is relatively small. All good, very good things. It was approved by the FDA in 1993. Interestingly, the FDA there's various pathways. The easiest one to get something approved through is what's called the 510K process. All you have to do is say that your technique is somewhat similar to something done by other people in the past. If you can make that argument, they say, well, it seems to have worked in the past, we'll approve your method as well. that's another ethical issue. Whether or not this shredding instrument was, in fact, equivalent to things in the past, I mean, I think that's open to debate. So they quickly became the choice for fibroid removal and hysterectomies. And by the late 1990s, almost 75,000 procedures had been done. And there were different companies. This was a boom for companies making this device. You just have to come up with basically a hand drill and a suction thing. However, there were some troubles, and what some people started noticing is that many of these people all of a sudden developed stage 4 cancer. And that's a serious, it's basically a death sentence. But it only became widely known that this was an issue when one of the patients who underwent this herself was an anesthesiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and her husband, I believe, was he was a cardiothoracic surgeon. So between the two of them, they had this really good medical background, and they didn't think it made any sense for Dr. Reed, who's the woman who went through this procedure, to all of a sudden have inoperable cancer. So, once again, this thing had been on the market for quite some time before the FDA received any adverse event notice, and it was only became noticed because it was filed by Dr. Reed. After that, it opened the floodgates. All of a sudden, the FDA received a whole lot more of these, many of them from manufacturers, but very, very few, this is once again an ethical issue, very few reports coming from hospitals themselves. Hospitals are making a lot of money through this procedure because they could do it so quickly. Johnson & Johnson, the same company I just mentioned earlier, with regard to the baby powder, they pulled the surgical device, and that opened up the doors for other companies to step in and start selling these things. So if you look at all the companies selling these morcellators, there's a long list of them. Okay, so what's the alternative? The alternative is a pretty invasive procedure where you do open surgery, you open up the lower part of the abdomen, you remove the uterus, there's more blood loss, there's a high risk of infection, it takes longer to recover, etc. But the issue at hand here is the fact that a morcellator, when it's shredding the tumor, it could be spraying cancer cells all around the abdomen. That's the risk of this device. Now the ethical, and this is an ethical issue to this day, if there's only a 0.3% chance of that happening, if you're a female patient, you've got to think to yourself, okay, I've got less than 0.5% chance of this being an issue for me, but if it is an issue for me, I'm going to die. It's an individual's choice, whether they want to say to the surgeon, I want a full open surgery, hysterectomy. I know it's going to take me a long time to recover, but at least if there is a cancerous tumor there, it's not going to be shredded and spread around my abdomen. So that's the primary ethical issue here. And I don't have an answer for it. First of all, I'm not a female, but I can't say if I thought there was a 0.3% chance of this happening to me, I would go one way or the other. Once again, I said I'm walking a tightrope here. This is when I get really close to religion. But Dr. Arthur Barry was the master of the National Maternity Hospital in Ireland. This is a Catholic hospital. Let me say, I'm married into a Catholic family. I was educated in a Catholic school. I've got nothing against Catholics. I love Catholics. But this is an ethical discussion. And so this is number 4 on the list here. Act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. So you're acting on behalf of the best interests of your client or your patient. So this is me holding a chainsaw in my back garden. And you may say, what the heck is he talking about here? I bet none of you knew that the reason for inventing a chainsaw was to cut through a woman's pelvis. It is unbelievable, but you can Google this and you can see where chainsaws came from. So this is what the thing looks like. It's called a device for doing a symphysiotomy, which is a cutting through the pubic symphysis. And the issue here is that if you're going to have a cesarean section because of the baby's breech or some other issue, you can't keep on doing that. You can do a cesarean section maybe three times. But if you want to have more than 3 children, after that, things become very problematic. So if a person is going to have a cesarean section, eventually you're going to want to say they should go onto birth control because you can't keep on doing cesarean sections. And this is where the issue came in with this hospital in Ireland. They didn't want to do cesarean sections because they didn't want patients to eventually have to go into use birth control. So this is what the pelvis looks like when you cut through it with a chainsaw. And after you've done this procedure and after the baby, first of all, the other ethical thing is they didn't often tell patients this. It's like you're going to give birth, it's a happy, exciting time. This person whips out this chainsaw thing, and the next thing, you've got your pelvis split into two, and the recovery from this is very difficult. You have to put this strap thing around your waist, you have to lie in bed, you've got to wear a catheter, you're dealing with infection. Sometimes, in fact, the instrument for cutting through the pelvis also penetrated the skull of the fetus and killed the fetus. So that's a whole other issue. Then you've got, obviously, a far worse situation on your hands. So the long-term effects of this procedure are chronic pain, imbalanced posture, improper walking pattern. You permanently enlarge your pelvis. Sometimes you have limited use of your legs. Sometimes you have recurrent kidney infections, urinary incontinency, difficulty in sex, and the mental trauma of undergoing this procedure. Can you imagine saying, to your husband, let's have another child, when you've just gone through this the first time? Okay, so this patient, Catherine McKeever, told the committee that was looking into the safety in this hospital that she did not realize what had happened. She said, I saw the doctor with an instrument that looked like a bit brace because my father was a wood turner. So this is what the bit brace thing looks like. And you can see how close the pubic symphysis is to the skull of the infant. All right, and you can go online. The stories of these women are just tragic. I was just 27 years old and I was butchered. I was screaming, it's not working, the anesthetic didn't work properly. And the bottom one here is after all this, they still did a C-section. So I like some of these quotes here. Women belong in places where decisions are being made. And I think that women, if they want to fight for the thing they care about, I'm guessing many women care about their pelvis. So the story about this is that nobody would listen to these women. The hospitals in Ireland wouldn't listen. I'm not going to go through the whole history here, but let me just jump to the part where there was eventually a solution to this. The woman went to the United Nations and claimed that there was human torture being performed. And it was only when the United Nations stepped into this and looked at the ethics of what they were doing in these hospitals that the issue was resolved. And when I say resolved, at least they stopped doing this procedure. The women are still, obviously, and this wasn't that long ago. This is not in the 1800s. This stopped in the 1990s. Okay, so, all right, so you can go through the bullet points here. There is some, if there is compensation is given under the condition that claimants discontinue any legal action. One woman refused to do that because she wanted to litigate against the state. And if you happen to pass away, there's no compensation for your family at all. So whatever compensation there was only to those who are still living. Okay, so going back to the bullet point here, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. I would hazard a guess to say that none of us here think that the hospital was acting in the best interests of the patients who were there to give birth. Okay, just wrapping up quickly here. If you see a company with the name Fidelis, which means trust and faith, a big red flag should go up. This company, Fidelis, came up with cardioverter-Defibrillator leads. And so the idea here is fantastic. You have a lead in your heart. If it detects some kind of abnormality, it automatically shocks your heart. You don't have to wait for somebody to come and put these paddles on you to give you a shock to revive you. The idea is great. Now imagine if you're an electrical engineer and you've got the wiring kind of mixed up, and you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you get this shot to your heart, and it was basically an electrical mistake or the wiring was an issue. And these things were undergoing spontaneous defibrillation randomly. And the company, once again, took a long time to recognize this. I'm going to end off, I think this is my last slide, on a positive note. I'm sure you feel like it's time to have something uplifting. So John Charnley, he's passed, but he's an orthopedic surgeon. In my humble opinion, he should have won the Nobel Prize for medicine. He changed orthopedic surgery. It took him 27 years to figure out a solution to patients with hip arthritis. Up until that time, if you had hip arthritis that was totally disabling, what they did was they just fused your thigh bone to your pelvis and you walked around with a stiff leg. He came up with the idea of an artificial ankle joint. The mistake he made was he used Teflon. I'm not sure if you saw somebody cooking in the kitchen with a Teflon frying pan, but you thought, man, Teflon, that's great. It's a lower coefficient of friction. I'm going to use that for this device. Turns out Teflon is a disaster when you put it in the human body, like the worst disaster imaginable. To Sir John Charnley's credit, he recognized this. They didn't have FDA, they didn't have internet or anything like that. He physically went to the American Academy of Surgeons in England and stood in front of the whole audience and said, I'm not on the program, but please stop using this device. It's terrible, it doesn't work, I'm working on a solution. And he did. He came up with something called high-density polyethylene. He then personally brought every patient who had the Teflon thing back to the hospital, replaced their hip with a high-density polyethylene, and it changed hip surgery. So for me, he's not an engineer, but he epitomizes somebody who, first of all, tried to solve a problem, recognized that the solution had a flaw, went out of his way to correct it, and did correct it. So on that uplifting note, I'm going to end and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.